The recording is starting. I want to thank everyone for joining us today for Dementia Friendly Tempe Presents. My name is Candace Hewitt, and I work for the City of Tempe as a Senior Social Services Coordinator. I'm responsible for Dementia Friendly Tempe programs, such as the Memory Cafe and these monthly presentations, which are scheduled on the second Wednesday of each month. Each presentation has a different topic related to caring for a loved one living with dementia. For more information on future presentations, please visit our website at www.tempe.gov/DFT. We will provide more information again at the end of the presentation. Next slide. Before we begin, I would just like to go over some housekeeping. Like many of you, we've moved our connection with the community online, and we're experiencing a bit of a learning curve as we shift our in-person presentations to a virtual format. So please bear with us. Today's presentation is Visiting Notes for Family and Friends, and our presenter today is Jan Doherty. Jan is a nursing expert and leader in the dementia care field and a member of our Dementia Friendly Tempe Action Team. If you move your cursor on your screen, a bar will appear with several icons, such as your video and microphone icons. During this presentation, to cut down on noises and distractions, all participants are muted, except for individuals who have called in. If you look at your microphone icon on the banner in the middle of your screen, you will see a slash through it, which indicates that you are muted. To unmute yourself, just click on your microphone icon, and when you're finished speaking, click on the microphone icon again to mute yourself. Our presenter will pause for questions throughout the presentation. If you want to ask a question, just click on the raised hand icon to indicate you have a question, and we'll call on you. Just remember to unmute yourself. Or if you prefer, you can type your question into the chat function by clicking the word cloud icon on the same bar in the middle of your screen, and Jan will respond to your question. So without any further delays, I'll turn it over to Jan to start the presentation.
Well, thank you, Candace, and I'm happy to join you all for our last Dementia Friendly Tempe lecture of 2020. And we thought it was a perfect time to really talk about how we might aim to give care partners ideas on how to enhance visits for the person with dementia for family and friends, because we find that often they tend to shy away, and the holiday times are often a time where we gather more frequently, although this year certainly will be different. But certainly increased communication over phone and now Zoom and FaceTime, etc., are becoming more common. So I hope over this next about hour or so that we spend together, we'll talk about and really reinforce why it's so important for family to stay connected to both the person living with dementia and the family caregiver care partner, and identify and I guess strategize some tips that family and friends can use so that they feel more successful in interacting with a person living with dementia. And finally, we'll talk about, what it might look like to make visits. Now, I had some debate about whether to keep this just kind of COVID related, but, I am very hopeful that sometime in 2021, we're going to see restrictions change. So I don't want to ignore that in-person visits are happening and will happen. And so we'll talk about those as well. So again, it's content not only for now, but I think very pertinent as we, I think, all look to a better 2021 where gatherings will be much more commonplace. So this first slide really speaks to how, as we age and we get to a point that we can look forward to retirement, that things don't always work out the way we had planned, especially when somebody we care about gets diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease or related dementia. We know that those plans can change. And a lot of the plans are about traveling, and most of the travel, quite honestly, is to be with family and friends and to experience life in a way that we often didn't have time for. And yet we know that when Alzheimer's disease strikes or related dementia, that there's stigma that's associated with it, that our society makes many kind of assumptions about what the person can or can't do, and that people living with one of these conditions is more likely to begin to socially withdraw because they're either aware that they're having these changes and they don't want to look inadequate, look stupid, look embarrassed. And we know that as that person withdraws, their primary care partner often withdraws as well and feels isolated. And certainly this year we have now a pandemic on top of that that's really created added isolation for all of us, because many of those certainly that are living with Alzheimer's disease related dementia are in an at-risk category already because of age, but then so are care partners as well. So we know that these outside contacts, certainly have become limited this year, but even prior to COVID, we saw that contacts became limited. And in fact, that's why Dementia Friendly Tempe created our Memory Cafe. We wanted a place where people felt safe and could come together and be with others, because the reality is we're all longing for support and companionship and friendship. As I said, there is a lot of stigma related to having a diagnosis of dementia, unfortunately, and many people make assumptions, and very wrong assumptions, about how someone is affected, when in fact they often know very little about the condition, and will assume abilities remain or abilities have been completely lost. And both sides of the equation can be completely off. And you joining this webinar today know that very much your person's abilities, not only are changing, but how your family and friends understand it are often very, very different. Unfortunately, the tendency that we see in our culture related to dementia, which adds to the stigma, is that we focus typically on the loss that the person is experiencing cognitively, rather than looking at what still remains in that person. So, for example, as I've worked with folks for almost 30 years, people living with dementia, often social skills are maintained very, very late into the illness. And we have a tendency sometimes to poo-poo that, or to say, well, that's not usually what they're like. Well, no, maybe not. But isn't it lovely when somebody we care about can rise to the occasion in a social situation and present themselves in quote unquote a normal way? I mean, it really reinforces the personhood and the spirit of the individual that we care about. Again, what we've learned through our work in Dementia Friendly Tempe, and it's certainly very well documented in the literature, is that family members and friends often report feeling awkward when they have to communicate with a person who has these changing memory and thinking abilities. They don't know how to respond to the person who is maybe repetitive or forgetting details, or maybe even what I call making up stories, which they're not making up, rather they're filling in the blanks for things that they've once forgotten. And that really puts many people at a loss on how do I respond to that? How do I go along with someone who thinks that her mother is still living when clearly she's 85 years old, or has been long gone? And so this creates this awkwardness, or often a reluctance to, why do I even want to communicate to this person whose reality has shifted so tremendously? We also know that as these things change cognitively for the person living with dementia, that often the conversation directly with that person stops altogether, because there's an assumption, well, what difference does it make? They're going to forget it anyways. Or there's a shift that rather than talking to the person living with dementia, I'm just going to talk to you, the family caregiver. And particularly we see this at medical appointments or, other gatherings where the person with dementia is just sitting there with no one asking them a question, because after all, what do they know anyways? I mean, that's, again, the stigma that comes from that. And I think from our family caregivers, we frequently hear their frustration that, why don't my family and friends just try harder? Why don't they make an effort to try to communicate with this person that I love? And I love this quote that came from a person living with dementia who says, it's hard enough losing your memory and your abilities without losing your friends as well. So imagine, you almost feel like you have a contagion of some sort, that all of a sudden the people that you've loved and you've cared about aren't even coming around. And again, I will say it's a lot of this is just the stigma or the misunderstanding that our greater community has about people who are living with various forms of dementia. And as I said, subsequently, this social isolation sets in because the person living with dementia can withdraw from those connections. After all, if they're not calling, and you probably all know that the person living with dementia often won't initiate kind of activities like they did in the past. So that means they're not going to initiate phone conversations. Just give you a personal anecdote. So our former babysitter, who we called Nanny, she was really like a surrogate mother to me. My folks had died early in life when I had my children. And this couple who came to stay with our children, when I worked part-time, we called Nanny and Papa. Well, Nanny called me frequently, and a number of years ago, she stopped calling. And interestingly, I thought, I wonder if I did something to offend her. I wonder what's going on. And when I called her, the context of the conversations had changed, where she had once often, again, asked about the kids, how's Katie, how's Tommy, very interested in my life, my husband's life, and none of that seemed to come. So here I am, dementia expert, right? So I'm just keeping it real here to say that I didn't see this. Well, about a month or two later, I heard from one of her daughters that called to say to me, I need to tell you that Mom has been diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease. Well, all of a sudden it made sense to me. Well, no wonder she stopped calling. Just she didn't have the same ability to remember how to call me. Of course, she's forgetting to ask the kinds of things that she once did. So again, you can see how this is kind of this creepy crawly kind of onset that you don't really even see it, even people like me, because I was relying on phone conversations because we live quite a distance apart. And again, she was beginning to socially isolate, a woman who was very outgoing, involved in a variety of clubs in her community, and loved to go play bingo. She was doing none of those things. And when we see, and she was widowed, but when we find that these individuals are married, often are living perhaps with an adult child, we find that that individual too doesn't keep up the same social connections as in the past. We know that these are individuals, both the person living with dementia and the care partner, who are at risk for depression, because let's face it, life has changed as we know it. And yet we know it's critical for both people living with dementia and care partners to stay engaged with others. As human beings, we were meant for connection. And those connections really help us to maintain a sense of our self-worth and our being and who we are. And in fact, when we apply this to the social isolation now we're seeing kind of globally, right? It's not just here in the US, it's throughout the world where we're going into lockdown mode. We're seeing a lot of mental health issues in people of all ages that really speaks to why it is so important for us to stay connected to one another. And particularly, those individuals who don't have access to, internet connection. Certainly Zoom meetings have helped us find a way to connect. But think about those who don't have that ability to do so. We were meant by design to be connected to others, even when living with advancing dementia. So we're going to talk about a variety of tips to stay connected. And by the way, this PowerPoint should be available to you as well as the recording. And I think it could be very helpful for you to share this with family and friends, because oftentimes I find that they just don't get it. Because we really want to help family and friends to keep the person with dementia in the forefront. We want them to stay connected. We want to be able to remind and encourage them about the importance of visits and phone calls. Again, that human connection doesn't stop just because you're living with a progressive brain disease. This is something that is so important for all of us. And again, I'm going to put in context the ongoing visits, because I realize right now, we're trying to limit this human connection. And yet for people who are living in bubbles, if it's a bubble to bubble, I'm going to say the human connection is still possible and should really be considered. Again, this is so important for quality of life, for the person living with dementia, for the family caregiver, and for family and friends too. We are all part of a circle where we need to stay connected and need to feel part of one another's lives. So let's begin with, often where things begin to break down, and that is as a diagnosis is made. And there's often a lot of discussion, or maybe none, about how or when we should disclose this diagnosis to family and friends. And it can be a tough decision. And quite honestly, in my work, I would say it's not a one size fits all. I think that for many people who are close to an individual, especially family members or very close friends within a network, they're probably likely have seen changes in the person prior to the diagnosis. And so I think when a diagnosis is made, coming back to those individuals, using words that work for you and for your person to share with them that indeed a diagnosis was made of a memory issue or whatever you want to call it. Again, I often say you don't need to use the A or the D word. And for some, it becomes very important to say I have Alzheimer's disease or I was diagnosed with dementia. But using that language to say, here's what it means. And then early in the diagnosis, I think that's also very important, is learning to ask for help and accepting it, both for the person with this diagnosis as well as for family members. And we'll talk about some examples for that. Because without letting people know, here's what I need from you, they're often not going to know. Remember, they can't even carry on a basic conversation. Why do you think that they would think they know how to help? Because oftentimes they don't. Again, this awkwardness kind of continues in that area as well. So here's an example of a gentleman named Dave, and these are all true situations where her husband noticed, or his wife, Linda, noticed that he had stopped playing golf with his usual, foursome group. And his comment was, well, he just didn't like the group any longer. He really didn't care. But she, in fact, reached out to his friends to learn that, in fact, he had missed some games, and they interpreted that he just wasn't really interested in continuing. And so Linda went on to explain to all three of them in separate phone calls that, he had been diagnosed with a memory condition, and that he really did enjoy being with them, and she really wanted him to stay connected to them for as long as it was feasible. And she understood that there would come a time when Dave could no longer probably keep pace with this group, or it just didn't make sense. But until then, she really hoped that that they would invite him to play golf. And thankfully, that's one of these COVID type resistant activities right now, right? That the golf course has been deemed somehow safe. But again, here his friends then were understanding, and they committed that they would come and pick him up, and that they would continue to play, and they would let her know when golf would no longer work. And in fact, it did work for another year or so. So again, that idea of how do I disclose to you what's important and say, hey, he really wants to be part of your life. We often find too that, family and friends just struggle to visit. And again, we'll talk about virtual visits, but I want to talk about in-person visits because, for some, they still are possible when people are really being protective. They're living in a bubble. We know that they're keeping their distance, they're wearing masks, they're keeping, et cetera. They're not sick, running fevers. But even during normal times prior to COVID, this came up frequently, that family and friends just saw it as a struggle. And as I said, it was and continues to be an important part of that person's life who is living with dementia. But family and friends particularly find it more difficult as the person progresses, because often they're not comfortable with this idea of reminiscing. Somehow they think it's ridiculous, it doesn't matter, it's repetitive, I don't want to hear the same story over for the 5th time. And they often are very uncomfortable with this idea that the person is slower to come up with their thoughts, their word finding or their word substituting. And yet that doesn't take away that the visit can't be meaningful and purposeful. So these become some really important tips, and many of these you're probably aware of. So one of the first things is that the visits or the phone calls, however those visits are going to take place, should be during the person's best time of the day. So I'm going to go, for example, back to our former nanny situation and tell you that when I visit, I check with her son in the morning to see what kind of night was it, because she now is in kind of the moderate to late moderate stage of her condition, and she often is sundowning, and some nights she's up most of the night. So it becomes really important in this situation that morning I check, one, is it even a good day? What kind of night did she have? And number 2, try to figure out when in the afternoon is the visit going to be best for her. The other thing is guidelines on how long the visit or the conversation should be. So sometimes the visitor, the family or friend, has kind of an unrealistic expectation about how long even that in-person visit should be. That this idea that we have to come over and spend an hour, which seems like maybe an eternity when I'm uncomfortable already communicating, could be just simply a 15-minute drive-by, or the 30-minute phone conversation. Really, that 5 minutes is going to be enough. So again, those are first important strategies, is letting them know what's the best time of day, how much time for phone or in-person visit would be good. The next thing is that when the visitor comes, whether they're calling, whether they're FaceTiming, or whether it's an in-person visit, and again, remember, it just depends on where the person is in the condition. It's often good to say, hi, Mom, it's your daughter, Kathy, if I'm calling. Or maybe it's an in-person visit that is happening where, hey, Bob, it's your golf buddy, Dave. Just giving them an indication of, I know you. That's what we're really trying to commit. Now, for early in the disease, often that's not an issue, but over the phone, it could be just giving that reminder. If in fact it appears that this person just doesn't seem to remember who you are. Because the last thing we want to do is the do you remember questions. So, for example, I was just recently in a situation where a daughter was greeting her mother, and she said to her, do you know who I am? What is my name? Well, that was a really unfair position to put the mom in, especially when the daughter is wearing a mask and now is much older and mom is much further in her condition. Why would you put her in such an awkward situation? And how many of us would want to have to respond maybe a high school friend that we have now not seen in 40 years. And Lord knows I look a lot different. And now I'm supposed to figure out who the heck you are with great hair and wrinkles. And oh, by the way, you've gained 40 pounds and so did I. And you've got a mask on and I'm supposed to remember who you are. I mean, that's just embarrassing. So we need to keep in mind, we want to avoid that. The other is, we want people prepared for the visit. So this is where, most of us will have a favorite story or memory of the past that we've been with that person. And that's what we want to keep in mind, joining them in a place that's comfortable, that's memorable, where they're likely remember, or we remember, and we can tell the story in a way in which the person is part of that story and can engage and feel like they're connected. I mean, the other thing to do is, if conversation is not our thing, is simply having a task that we can do together. So maybe I bring over cookie mix and I begin to make cookies with that person, and maybe what they're doing is scooping or simply putting the cookie tray in the oven. Again, this idea that we're doing things together. So again, it's important that it's really not about the amount of time together. Rather, it's about what we can do together, how we can spend this time together and share it in a way that creates pleasure, that creates participation, and where the person and you feel present. Again, those become really important things, because if you're not fully present, guess what? They're not going to respond to you in that way. Because one thing I'll remind you is that emotional memory stays right to the end. And I can read your emotional energy. I can read your body language to know if you are really fully present with me in this moment, doing things that seem to matter. So here's a common situation. Now, obviously, this was pre-COVID. I know that most of our residential settings are very restrictive in their visits right now. But here's a classic where a woman named Nora moved into a memory care community. Again, it was a residential setting, and her daughter, Mina, liked to go see her mom, but every time she would go visit with her mom was angry with her daughter and blamed her for dumping her here. And the visits became stressful for both of them. So as you can imagine, again, this is where I'm going to come back to this emotional memory. You can imagine this daughter was walking into this memory care community to visit her mom, and she was probably a bundle of nerves, right? She is feeling defensive. She's already getting ready to feel attacked. Just imagine the kind of body language that she went in with, right? So you can see where then her body language was translating to that of her mother. And the visits became all about, why did you put me here, rather than something that could be pleasurable. And so this daughter got some counsel and decided to make the visits more about an activity, something that could engage her mom. So in this case, she decided to bring in cupcakes. Her mom was a baker and had really loved to do things like this, homemaking kinds of things. And so here we have Mina bringing in cupcakes that she could then have Nora help decorate, as well as putting on some music, and they were engaged in an activity together. And guess what? The visits became much better, because now mom's mind was focused on something pleasurable, something that she and her daughter could do together. And guess what? Her daughter's anxiety and frustration also melted away, which gave her better energy to really engage with her mom. So we find that also extended family, right, often just don't get it. So extended means from our adult children, grandchildren, our siblings, those kinds of folks. So here we have a situation where the wife, Julie, is the primary caregiver for her husband, Jim. And, they had two adult children who, of course, were working full time and busy with their own kids and work. But Julie gets pretty angry about the fact that her kids just aren't calling, much less visiting. And she remained pretty silent about this because her kids, quite honestly, thought, well, she's got everything covered. I mean, after all, we asked her, Mom, do you need anything? And she says, no, we're fine. And then one day she blows up at her daughter for not calling her dad. Like, I can't believe that you won't even take the time to call your father. And here, the daughter's recognizing, we didn't even know you were angry. What do you need? So this idea is we also, as care partners, caregivers, need to learn to say to our family, I need help. I need you to connect. This is really hurting me that you're not even trying to connect with your sister, with your mom, whoever that might be relationship wise to you. Now, a lot of this is even around phone connection, especially because families, often live apart. And even in this valley, it's a long ways from, for example, Queen Creek to Tempe. And that, phone connection, especially now in the face of COVID, has become a much safer form of communication. And yet it's an important form of communication. But remember, as I said, as the disease progresses and even early on, the person's going to lose their ability to call their family and friends. And just like me, I incorrectly interpreted this as disinterest, or maybe the person's mad at me. So again, just understand that even the best of us can misinterpret these kinds of situations. If this is a person who's been close to you and all of a sudden they're not calling, we should begin to ask ourselves, what in the world's going on? Just know that, the phone has become increasingly complex. Many of us have gotten rid of our landlines and now it's a cell phone. And I'm sorry, cell phones are just really going to be foreign to older adults. Again, if you've not had years and years of working with cell phones, it just is way too complex to understand not only how to call, but how to accept that call. Now, in 10 years from now, as people develop dementia, it's going to be much more intuitive. They're going to have longer term memory on how to do it. But right now, we've got to help these folks. And even this idea of webcams and Skype and FaceTime, yes, they can create connections, but it's very foreign to this person who's living with dementia. So we're going to have to be prepared, not only in assisting the person to make the connection or to take the call or take the Skype or FaceTime, but we also want to have family and friends prepared to lead the phone call and lead the conversation. So they've got to think about it. And again, often they're relying on our lead to tell them, hey, here's what, ask her about this, or why don't you chat about that? Or tell them what's going on with the kids or with your new puppy or whatever that is. So you as a caregiver are going to be relied on to help give them ideas and let them know that it's okay to revisit the same conversation every single time that phone call takes place. Again, Zoom visits, I think, have become very commonplace, and thank goodness for Zoom and having the free platform, or now Microsoft Teams, right? We're working in, I guess, as Microsoft has moved from Skype to Teams, again, it has become another way to create a way for us at least to be able to connect, not only for a person living with dementia, but for any older adult as well as a caregiver. Again, same thing with Zoom calls, what's the best time of the day for this to happen? Let's have an agenda so that we're prepared to go with this conversation. And again, this is where I think we need to help empower our family and friends. Let them be in charge of the agenda. Our job is to guide them. Here are the conversations, maybe here are the questions to ask. But also think about including an activity. Maybe you decide, let's bake some cookies together, where maybe as an adult daughter, I'm going to use this, where your mom taught you how to make cookies. Well, today we're going to have an activity where I'm baking the cookies and we're now maybe reminiscing. Maybe I've got some Christmas music playing in the background, or even having some basic crafts that the person living with dementia, the caregiver, maybe can do perhaps even with a grandchild over a Zoom kind of connection. So don't diminish what kinds of visits can really happen through Zoom. I think our creativity really will create a variety of activities where it makes it, again, purposeful, we're present, and it just really becomes fun. The other thing I think to remind, maybe you're caring for somebody who's too far advanced to even use Zoom or FaceTime, because there does come a point where the technology just won't work. Let's be real, it's just not going to work. But that doesn't mean that these visits aren't important for you as well. So again, let your family and friends know that I need your visit. I need you to call me. I need to hear from you. I need to have this sense of connection, or I need to have a place where I can dump when I'm feeling frustrated. Listen to me, and you won't criticize, but you'll support me just as you would your best friend. So here's an example of a Zoom, I guess it took place over the course of a wedding, where here we had a couple who was getting married, and Phyllis, who had COPD or emphysema. She's the caregiver for her husband, Mort, who has dementia, and their grandson is getting married, and the whole family was attending. Obviously, this is pre-COVID, but, you know, again, these things are going to happen again. And they really wanted, obviously, Phyllis and her husband to attend, but she just felt like, no, he can't make the trip. And so her husband, or her son, excuse me, bought her an iPad and taught her basically the basics, and then the niece provided FaceTime for Phyllis during the wedding, and that way she was able to see her grandson get married and be part of this. So there will come a time where we have to pivot and find new ways, and certainly this pandemic has taught us all that we need to find other ways. But technology can be really helpful, and I think if anything good comes out of this pandemic, I think it's that maybe we'll all be a little more savvy with using these, and maybe families will be more accepting of visits taking place this way. So again, it would be important that even with these sorts of visits, that it's during the person's best time of the day and they understand the interaction. Again, once again, through this virtual mean that we're introducing ourselves, kind of reminding the other person on the other end of who they are. I mean, what's the worst? Where the dad says, I know who you are, for heaven's sake. I'd rather he acknowledge that than I make an assumption and kind of lose him very quickly during our visit. Again, the caller knows what the person likes to talk about, and they give the person plenty of time to respond. And we encourage the caller to tell them pleasant stories. I mean, who doesn't like to hear a good story these days? In fact, I think that too much of the news and airways are filled with bad stories, when what we need to hear about what is working well, you know, what are the kids still enjoying, you know, what are the pets up to lately, or what are the grandchildren up to? And even though I might not remember that grandchild, hearing you tell this story and laughing is going to transfer to me. I'm going to feel that positivity. So here would be an example of a college student, a granddaughter who goes away, and she calls her grandfather on the phone and says, hi, Grandpa, you know, it's me, Sophie. I'm calling from college in Colorado. So she's giving him some added information to say, you know, first of all, Grandpa, not Dad, and Sophie, your granddaughter, and oh, by the way, I'm not here in Arizona, I'm in Colorado, right? So whether that sinks in or not, but she's giving him some added information that helps ground him to who's on this other line. And then she just shares, you know, some things that are happening here in her freshman year at Colorado State. And Lord knows these poor kids in college are certainly having a very different year in the past. But maybe she's saying, hey, you know, we've gotten some snow here already, and you know what, I'm planning to go skiing. And by the way, you know, I just love math class, Grandpa, you were an engineer. Did you like math too? Or just asking, what was your favorite subject? I hear you were really good with. And she keeps this call to about 10 minutes and just says, hey, I really love you. I really miss you. I can't wait to see you. And I'm going to call again soon. Now, here would be another teaching tip. So sometimes as cognitive adults, where our timetables are working, our internal clock works, we have this tendency, I'm going to call you in 2 weeks. Well, person doesn't know what 2 weeks is, rather than just saying, I'm going to call you again real soon. It's kind of like when we visit somebody. Do we really need to say, I'm going to see you tomorrow, when they're likely to forget what is tomorrow? I mean, I'm going to forget 5 minutes from now, rather than I'm going to see you again soon. So again, keeping these kind of comments just open and upbeat can be incredibly positive. So dining out or at home. So right now we are still allowed to dine out, and hopefully if you're doing that, well, I'm going to talk about the hours, but you're doing it in a place where you can be socially distanced. I have to say, I think our restaurants have been very responsible, but now's a time when many high-risk groups are thinking, nope, I'm going to order in rather than take out. But we will be dining out again, hopefully, or at home with larger groups, probably not during this holiday season, but let's hopefully late summer, early fall, and maybe by a year from now. But just understand that in a group, so when you get more than 4 people, this is going to be taxing. There's just too much commotion. There's often too much conversation. If we're out to a restaurant, there's music blasting in the background. All of this is going to make it more difficult for the person living with dementia to stay focused. So even at home, I would say you need to think about the background noise. Is the TV on? It shouldn't be. Is there music on that maybe could be interfering with their ability to follow a conversation? It's also important, I think, when we're getting together with people for a meal, that the family caregiver be considered in this, and that they should be able to enjoy this dinner and not be the companion for this person living with dementia. That means that somebody else is going to be present with this person and keep them engaged in conversation, or help them engage in the conversation at hand at the table. So I like to, what I call, assign a buddy. And that is, identify maybe this adult child, or, my siblings are going to be coming over. Maybe I'm the daughter and I'm caring for my mom, and, I'm inviting my sister and her husband over. But, tonight I'd like to not be the one engaging in conversation. So I tell my sister, hey, I really want you to sit by mom, and I want you to engage in conversation. So I'm going to do this in advance. I'm not going to spring it on her. Rather, I'm going to say, here's what I'd like from you. And by the way, here are the conversations that you and mom are able to have. So here's an example of, friendship and lunch with friends. So this is a couple who attended, again, this is all pre-COVID, but again, I kept this in because there's going to be post-COVID. And they attended church every Sunday, and their habit, if you will, was going to brunch afterwards with a group of their friends who they've known for years through church. But the problem is the church service is long and the restaurant is noisy, and her husband gets lost in conversation and often just wants to leave. I mean, it creates stress for Carol. And she's sad because she misses this activity, right? She had to give it up. So she decides to talk to her friend Ruth. And, here we could say, why doesn't Ruth get it? Well, Ruth doesn't get it because she's not living with it, right? So here it's on us. And she says, look, I really love being with you all. I miss this, but it just isn't going to happen this way anymore. Yet I want to stay connected. So instead they make plans for an afternoon lunch or tea at Ruth's home. So Ruth invites them to her house, right? Because the last thing Carol needs is to entertain. And this then allows Mark to go home and rest after church. And this way, when they get together, he's with fewer people. So we need to think about how do we modify these gatherings. And even when we're in a bubble right now and maybe going to each other's homes, how is it we limit the number of people, make sure that it's at the best time of the day for that individual. So again, things I come back to is what's that person's best time of day, you know, keeping it small. As I say, less than 4 people, 4 or less is the ideal number, simply because it's much more intimate. We want to include that person. So that means if it's a little larger group, we have a buddy who's prepared to just have conversation, you know, to touch their arm, to say, isn't that good? Again, it doesn't have to be a complex discussion. Again, if you decide to eat out, eating out off hours, again, that means that we're going in for an early or late lunch or for an early dinner. And even when COVID goes away, these principles will apply, because too much noise and chaos is just going to create too much distraction and stress for the person living with dementia. The other with eating out is really being prepared, looking at the menu ahead of time, so you have a chance to review it with your loved one, because remember, they're often going to lose reading comprehension, or they hear the word spaghetti and they don't know the difference between spaghetti and meatballs or linguine with clams, right? If you're going to an Italian restaurant. So you now have time to review that and maybe look at pictures, so that when you go out, you can say to your loved one, boy, I'm so glad we looked at the menu, and I think you said that spaghetti with meatballs sounds good. Or let's say they order something you believe they're going to hate, you're going to order something that you know they love and switch plates. So again, you're prepared for this. And when you're at your house, you know, and right now, you know, ordering out, just having food brought to your home, or, you know, for heaven's sakes, it's the holidays. Let people bring food to you. If you're caregiving, the last thing you need to be doing is thinking about entertaining everybody else. Or if you are, remember just to keep it simple. You don't need more on your plate. Now, visiting people as they move into this advanced stage of the illness. So what does advanced dementia look like? Well, these are people who are moving a lot less. Their walking has slowed down pretty tremendously. They're often their posture is much more hunched over. They're sleeping for very long periods of day, maybe up to 20 hours. They often are finding it hard to stay connected to a favorite television show or a favorite activity for more than 30 minutes, and maybe 15 minutes you see them dozing off. That's kind of advanced dementia. And so we know and accept that verbal communication is just more difficult than in the past. And it's important that we plan visits or telephone calls during a time that the person is much more likely to be awake or alert, and that those conversations or visits are generally under 30 minutes. So we have to be realistic about how much time are we going to spend. Becomes incredibly important at this point that we absolutely introduce our name and our connection to them. Hi, it's Bob. I'm your oldest son. This is Alice. I was your neighbor next door. Whatever. You know, I'm your best friend. Doesn't matter. Just giving people what it is they need in order to kind of connect you and feel like they're part of your network. Again, this is where our emotional energy becomes so important. So as I come in, I've got a smile on my face and I'm saying, hi, Mom, it's so good to see you. It's your daughter, Jan. You're just looking beautiful today. Again, when touch is allowed, you know, and I realize a lot of folks with advanced dementia are in residential settings and maybe not making these visits at this point. But again, at home, making touch appropriate. I mean, we need the human touch. And just know that this is when technology is far less useful than in the past. It's probably not going to be working maybe as you'd hope that it would. And this is where the visits really become sensory. There's a really great research that shows that when we layer the senses, we're more likely to connect with that person. And that's why touching can be so important. Just a gentle touch or holding that person's hand. This is where these favorite treats are so incredibly good. And what's better than some ice cream or maybe a Dairy Queen Blizzard or a favorite cookie that a person would like. This is where looking at photos or scenic landscapes, again, right now with the holidays, I have a candle burning that smells just like Christmas at this time. And even though we live in the desert, there's something about seeing a landscape with snow or travel photos or an animal, whatever it might be, or maybe you bring a Christmas card that has a beautiful photo that you're using it and you're talking about this and you're reminiscing. Perhaps you're putting on some background music and you start singing Away in the Manger, something that we learned in childhood. That's going to be much more familiar to that person, and slowing the tempo down and just really repeating the chorus over and over again that allows this person to join in song with us. And again, the smell of something. So this is the time of year I make cinnamon rolls, but hey, you can go to the store and buy the cinnamon rolls already made, or you can buy them in a can where you break open the can and bake them there. That just creates this aroma in something that you can enjoy together. So as you can imagine making a visit right now where you can come in and introduce yourself and hold your hand and start the cinnamon rolls baking and reminisce about doing those kind of Christmas baking that you used to do and looking at photos and having this Christmas music, you are much more likely to create a connection. And then it's something that's staged, it's planned, far more successful. So it becomes so important for us to ask for help with these visits. And it's not a sign of weakness, rather it's a sign of strength. We need to be gentle, and yet we need to be directive with family and friends about how we could use their help with connecting with our loved one, especially right now when things are just so out of whack. We need to be able to say, here's some things you could help me with that would be tremendously helpful. It's important to let our friends know, look, we need to maintain this relationship with you, and maybe here's how it might work. You know, in fact, I had somebody recently tell me that they connected with a couple that they knew in a local park. So that way they were outdoors. It was a beautiful day. They brought their lunch and they sat at a large picnic table, right? That this is something we care about. Again, being specific on how that visit is likely to work. And when it's something you need, being very specific about what your need might be. Now, I decided to talk about residential visits, and I realize right now they're really wacky depending on where the person lives. It seems like group homes right now are easier to visit. One of the concerns is we're seeing COVID higher in residential settings where there are multiple people who can go in and out. So you've got, dietary and therapists and doctors and nurses and, staff. This is where we're seeing higher rates of COVID. But in usual situations, again, where we're making visits in a residential setting, again, we need to be relaxed and be ourselves, right? And coming in with this cheerful, emotional positivity, and having flexibility and accepting that maybe the visit won't go the way that we wanted it to. And this is where I think as we prepare and think about how can I come in and have something to share or something to do. And again, as I leave this visit, just saying it's so wonderful to see you, and I can't wait to see you again. We don't want to rush the person ever. You know, just giving them time even to register kind of who we are, becoming more comfortable with silence and not seeing this as a negative thing, that sometimes sitting in silence and maybe listening to beautiful music and just holding hands is enough today for this visit. This is where having someplace quiet to go can be very, very helpful. And appreciating that while maybe your visit is quickly forgotten, it doesn't mean that the time that you spent together isn't important. And then finally, I guess the final tip is just being kind to yourself. You know, the reality is sometimes you're going to leave these visits and feel sad. And it's okay. It's okay because you're grieving the loss of somebody and something you've known to be important to you. So I hope in summary that some of these tips can be helpful, because we know that, you know, the holidays are here, and even though they're different, connections are vital for you as a family caregiver, but they're certainly vital for the person living with dementia. And, you know, birthdays too are just a wonderful time to connect. Hopefully you understand that using these familiar visits and activities are wonderful ways to stay connected. And it's, for me, it's always a reminder that dementia is a disease of the brain. It's not a disease of the spirit or the soul. That spirit remains alive and well into the advanced stages to the disease, and in fact, right to the end, because the emotional memory is what lasts the longest. And when we can provide these visiting tips and notes to family and friends, they're more likely to stay connected. One thing I'd like to tell you, this is kind of a little preview for January, but we're doing our Dementia Friends session. And this teaches our community members what dementia looks like, and it teaches them some basic strategies for communication. And we thought it would be a really terrific way to start the year. So maybe you've got some family members who you know could benefit from learning a little bit more about dementia. The emphasis isn't so much about learning about dementia as it is about what it means to be a friend to someone living with dementia, and how they can learn these important tips that can make a difference. So there's our link for that. And with that, I didn't see any questions popping up in the comments page or pane, but boy, I would certainly welcome any thoughts, questions, ideas that any of you might have. This is a great time for us to learn together. And since I'm hearing kind of a pregnant pause, if you will, let me see, and maybe you just want to type in a question to the question pane. Let me just say we've got a great schedule planned for 2021. Our Dementia Friendly Tempe Presents will continue on every second Wednesday of the month from 1 to 2:30. I've listed our first 4 lectures of the year, and you'll be able to visit our website at tempe.gov/DFT. Again, we're very excited to stay connected. We certainly look forward to a time when we can gather in person, but until then, I'm thankful that we have this virtual option to stay connected to you all. So I don't see any questions coming through the pane. So Candace, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Okay. Thank you, Jan. It was a wonderful presentation. And thank you everyone for joining us. The email's there on the screen. If you have any questions, want a copy of the PowerPoint, just go ahead and email me. And thank you for coming. And have a great afternoon.